My name is David Plumb. I'm a veterinarian registered in New South Wales, and I was previously an on-plant veterinarian for the Department of Agriculture. An on-plant veterinarian is a veterinarian who is empowered as the regulatory presence on the export abattoir.
Can you describe the day-to-day operations of an OPV?
So you start at the slaughter point, effectively, and then your first thing is you check the animals prior to the beginning of the slaughtering and the development of the processing rooms. And then you spend your day following through different schedules. For example, when I was there was a 4-week rotation of the various tasks. Some would be every week, some would be every 2 weeks, some would be once a month. You would have a long list of different verifications that you would have to complete each day, making sure that you examined all those different areas of production. So it really extended to the standards, not just for the food safety, but also for the welfare of the animals. And what you're looking for are defects. All those defects are then noted, and all those defects should be noted. And some of those defects will work in an accumulating fashion so that there's a rating given to the performance of the plant on that day or that shift, because many vets will only work one shift at a plant. Sometimes you'll be asked to do more, but many plants operate 2 shifts. So there could be a couple of vets working and they work together, but one will have a certain time requirement and another will have a different time requirement.
How does the OPV interact with the department? What's the hierarchy like?
Largely, the vet would be left by themselves to do their work. So you've got the food safety auditors under you, you work together with them on plant. Above you there is an area technical manager. He's one of a group of, I think, approximately 12 to 15 in Australia. The area technical manager is an experienced person who is there to give you technical advice, particularly when you encounter novel problems. So they have a very important role. Above them, there is a small group of vets called field operation managers, and those veterinarians are the top level of the veterinary field in the export meat division. Running in parallel to the group of veterinarians, though, there are the assistant directors and directors. The assistant directors and directors are there to liaise between the body of the vets and the public service effectively. Unfortunately, in my experience, I found that the assistant directors were not really educated about meat science, not really educated about veterinary matters, and often came from backgrounds that had never given them any relevant experience. Their job was to assist the vets, but they are also the people who are in charge of hiring the vets, and in many circumstances, they're the people who control what the vets do, even though they have no relevant veterinary experience. So it's a real tension between the professionalism of the vets and the requirements of the department to get positive outcomes, regardless of the veterinary experience and findings with the vet verification process. So there's a constant tension there. And historically, that's been a tension for many years. I think myself, it's quite a difficult circumstance to live professionally qualified people answering to people who have no relevant experience and are not professionally qualified themselves, particularly when it comes to matters like food safety and animal welfare.
Can you tell me a bit about the public interest disclosure that you have made?
I've made the decision that the experience that I had within the department was so substandard that it really requires public exposure. There is insufficient transparency in the public service, in my experience. Public interest disclosures, what people would know as whistleblowing. Within that legislation, I think that if you are honest, it is designed to bring whistleblowers and the information they have forward, to neatly contain it, to say an investigation has been conducted, to minimise any findings, and to isolate and contain any damaging information in a small black box out of everybody's conscious experience. The experience of the OPV, which I can talk about specifically because it was matters disclosed, would start at an abattoir in Victoria, which was quite elderly plant, I guess you may say, which had certainly some infrastructure problems. The staff made me aware of 3 particular incidents where animals had not been fit to load. So I processed all of them as is the normal form. In the course of doing that and an ante-mortem inspection, I also found a further animal. So I dutifully wrote up those 4 animal welfare reports. That is usually something where the establishment is given an opportunity to have their input and recognition of that problem before the matter is sent to the state authorities. You can imagine the average abattoir is not interested in their clients getting in trouble for sending the animals to them, so they're often not very cooperative. I asked for the opportunity to witness the swabbing of the carcasses. This is a fundamental risk control process that must be done at a certain time in the process to ensure food safety. Unfortunately, at that plant, I was met with hostility and a variety of really incredible explanations as to why they weren't able to allow me to do it. The first clue that gave me the idea that this was something that I should really try to pursue, because you're often led astray by plants. They'll give you a false audit trail, or red herrings are laid down to misdirect you into other areas. So the particular response that came from the production manager was, as is our custom, we swab the carcasses at 3:30 in the morning, which is a fine thing to do, except no staff were ever there to witness it. So when I reminded him of this, he did certainly express his frustration. This was getting towards the end of the week there, and generally we would have a management and vet meeting each week. Well, I received a phone call that evening that my services were no longer required at that abattoir. They don't need any vets there tomorrow. Now, that's a very unusual thing for them to be trying to say, because the vet must always be on plant before any killing and processing can occur. They did ask me to then move to a plant which was also in. I made inquiries with the other vets who'd been there, and basically their description of the other plant was, it's a nightmare. So of course I approached this with considerable trepidation. When I went to the second plant, I found that it was very old. And I think it may have been one of the oldest abattoirs in Australia. I think those original parts were still there. So I was a bit confronted by the dilapidated and antiquated infrastructure of the plant. They were only starting a soft restart, I think, in that they were only working on 3 days a week, and they had relatively limited production runs. My first impression was they're struggling. Honestly, that would be about all I could say about it, but my job then is to go in to work cooperatively with them to try to highlight these problems and to get them to address them. They were only having very limited operations, so they were only slaughtering animals twice a week. So that would be the first day I was there was a Tuesday. So it was really more of a familiarisation and learning all the staff and trying to introduce myself to the quality control team, learning the various production managers. The second day, they were just doing processing, which means the general cycle within an abattoir is that an animal will be killed and the carcass will be dressed, meaning you shall remove certain parts, the skin, and you'll have 2 half carcasses which are put into a chiller. Body temperature must drop to a certain point. That's for the control of bacterial overgrowth and growth on the carcass. Once it is shown that those parameters have been met, the bodies can be removed from the chiller into a boning room, which is really a giant chiller, and then the carcass will be cut up into various pieces. It was on the third day that I had got into the swing of things, and I assumed my normal routine, which is to make sure that I checked the slaughter point. The slaughter point, I feel, is the most important thing for the vets to check, because it is the focus point of all the instances where things can go terribly wrong. Under the strictures of the PID legislation, I should probably even read some of this to you, if that is okay.
Absolutely.
The plant I was sent to was processing 400 to 500 male calves, which are 5 days old, per day. They were also processing sheep, lambs and rams, but not at that time. In the past, this had been a domestic abattoir, and they had also been processing pigs. To minimise stress and delay, calves would always usually go first. So in this instance, that was the only animal that they were killing on the day, so there wasn't any problem there. Bobby calves, as they're called, are male calves. Female calves, I think people will understand, generally are kept. In the dairy industry, the females are useful. They're the milk-producing animals. And the bobby calves, in many ways, are considered a byproduct of the dairy industry. An animal is required to be rendered insensate, meaning there's no consciousness and it cannot really feel any pain. For calves, this is usually done by electric stunning, applying electrodes to either side of the skull to render the calf unable to sense anything. I attended the slaughter point, and very quickly, in fact within only several animals having been processed, did I see that there was an inadequate stunning occurring. This is something that you can find because the animals are making conscious and voluntary movements. Sometimes there was vocalisation, eyes blinking and ears moving. Once I had seen this, I told the halal slaughterman this is not acceptable and that he should captive bolt the calf. Now, for people not familiar with a captive bolt, that is a modified explosive device, rather like a handgun, but instead of having a projectile, it just has a short metal rod that penetrates the skull, and the effect of that is to kill the animal instantly. So I was really suggesting that the stunning was not working and he had to do the appropriate thing. His retort at that point was, "No, mate, they all do that." That, of course, was a real red flag to me. I thought, I am probably really going to have to look very carefully into this situation. The slaughterman was not perturbed by my direction to stop and to do that because he was convinced that what he had been exposed to was the normal way for things to proceed. So he continued to slaughter the calves, cutting their throats and performing an operation called a thoracic stick. Now, the thoracic stick is something that has to be done because calves are very young animals, effectively neonates, and unlike mature animals, they will have a secondary supply of blood to the brain through their vertebral arteries, which run up in the spinal column, rather than the carotid arteries, which are the primary and major source in adult animals. The thoracic stick is a very gruesome procedure where a long, thin knife is introduced through this point in the neck, and the blade is moved from side to side so that it severs all the major vessels around the heart. So this is a fairly gruesome thing, and my concern was these animals were not insensate, and this slaughterman didn't seem to have the awareness that this was a significant problem. I saw the calves at the killing point at the abattoir, blinking their eyes and looking up voluntarily. Because the department is a bureaucratic organisation, I of course remembered that I should consult with the ATM. The ATM is an area technical manager. They are a veterinarian with experience in the department. They usually have worked as an OPV for an extended period of time. They have gone into a management position, and so they are meant to be superiorly technically equipped so that they can assist people who are needing direction. I would have to say, in my personal experience, that was a variable experience, asking them for assistance. They often had to be reminded of the fact that that was one part of their job, for example. The first ATM that I talked to, who was the ATM responsible for this particular abattoir, left me without any really useful information. He couldn't describe himself the terms and physical signs that I should be looking for, and he did ask me to go and look at some meat notices so that I could be sure that what I was witnessing was correct, or rather, my deduction that the process was failing was correct. That ATM gave me 2 meat notice references. These are technical detail notices, a very important part of the continuing education for the veterinarians, but neither of the ones that he had referenced were related to slaughter or stunning. So, using the fact that I needed to return to the site to form a record visually and in my records about what was happening, I proceeded back to the slaughter point. Having only been reinforced in the belief that the animals were not being stunned correctly, I then went and contacted a second ATM. He again had no relevant or useful information to provide. And I was beginning at this point to become quite frustrated with the lack of significant help that was available in what was really a very dramatically challenging and physically confronting environment. I would have to say I was beginning to develop some stress. However, after then returning again to just confirm that everything was correct, I contacted a third ATM, and the third ATM gave me the exactly correct reference. I could then, armed with the relevant information, go back and start to integrate that knowledge into my response with the senior management at the plant. But at this plant, a second very disturbing revelation came from the quality control staff. When I went to them and I asked them for their slaughter protocol, their statement to me was, "We don't have those. We've only been here 2 weeks and we're starting on writing them now." Now this made sense because the plant they had been at had been closed for a long period of time, and I guess they had been recruited. I had automatically assumed that there had been somebody else, but I have the suspicion that they were the first quality control people to arrive on the site. The challenging thing for the OPV is how do you process the idea that in fact there weren't any protocols in place at this abattoir, which had been open for 5 months. At the time, my concern was not the paperwork at the abattoir. My concern was to use my experience and the information I'd received to cease this from continuing. So I returned again to the slaughter point, having taken the production manager with me, and I think he was the acting plant manager and the quality assurance manager. While they were there with me at the slaughter point, they could only agree with me that the stunning was not working, graphically demonstrated by one animal being stunned, and the animals, because they're quite small, they move up a conveyor belt, which is a V-shaped rubber belt on either side, so they come up to the slaughter point. And this animal was stunned, rolled forwards onto the table where it would normally have had its throat cut and the thoracic stick applied, except that it stood up and looked at us all and jumped up. So I said to the people at the slaughter point, "Okay, you can see this is not working well." And their response was, "Oh, that's okay, we just give it 10 minutes to calm down and then we send it around again." So it really was giving light to the fact that I think the standards in this plant were something that I really had to very thoroughly investigate. I think people will appreciate this as a particularly confronting and gruesome job. This is not a job that many people would find comfortable to perform. They would not even wish to be in the environment of such sort of activities. It is really the challenge for the vets to enter into these forums and to maintain standards. They need to do so in a very emotionally challenging and even intellectually challenging environment, because you do need to make sure that the foremost priority you have is the welfare of the animals. Yeah? And it really makes you reflect as a veterinarian upon the fact that this department doesn't prioritise in that way. They prioritise, I would estimate, the production of a safe product over the animal welfare concerns. While this process was occurring, largely the thing that I think people will find very difficult to comprehend is, why couldn't you stop it? Largely the industry works in a manner of, there's a problem, the problem can run, and then once we understand there's a problem, we'll go back and correct the problem. This sort of mentality, I think, comes from the idea of product recall. But I think that in circumstances where it's the immediacy of the physical discomfort of the animals, more dramatic intervention should be allowed. But the ATMs are very good at dissuading you from acting precipitously, and they want you to have a good body of evidence, because you must always have what is termed the legislative reference for every action that you do. In this case, I really needed to work hard to confirm that what I was observing was an abnormality. So that required me to basically stay in the vicinity of the slaughter point for extended periods of time. Naturally, as any human being in that circumstance, aware of what is happening, you would become quite stressed. And I knew that I was becoming stressed because I was actually consulting with other veterinarians, because the ATMs were not proving to be very useful, apart from the third gentleman, who was extremely useful. So I contacted other vets. The trouble is, the slaughtering of calves is not a very frequent event. It is something that only happens occasionally and only in a few plants. So there isn't a wide body of knowledge and experience about this particular matter. Once I had been able to convince the acting plant manager and the quality assurance manager that there was a problem, they understood. But by that stage, they were only slaughtering for 3 hours. It was approaching the end of the day, so effectively the slaughter just came to an end of its own accord. As is the normal requirement, I wrote up all of my findings, I made notes. I need to do this because there would be another vet coming the following week. They would have to pick up where I had left off. They would then be required to report some of these things to the relevant authorities. One of the big limitations on me on that day was that in the training process, the assistant director prioritised minimising my wages rather than maximising my exposure to all the different features that I would be exposed to in the job. Calves should be killed first on any day of slaughtering because they are the most sensitive of animals, which also require the greatest care. But because that often occurs at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I was directed by my assistant director, don't turn up at those times. We don't need you there. You can do all your training at other times. Except there are no calves being killed in the middle of the day. So it was a total failure of the training procedure. That, of course, then introduced an element of doubt into all of my considerations. That's why I was very careful and made sure that I went through this very thoroughly. I had multiple instances where there were inadequacies in terms of the response of the calves. At the end of the day, the management of the plant agreed that there was a problem. This then was an interesting circumstance because, as you would be aware now that I've entered a public interest disclosure and I'm reporting these deficiencies to the Ombudsman, which is independent of the Department of Agriculture. The lack of training meant I could not be forceful enough to intercede and to really cut off that procedure. And that then brings the pressure back onto yourself, the stress, is the problem me, is the problem the failure? But I had been very diligent through my career in the department, going to the slaughter points at every plant that I went to, and I was quite sure that I was witnessing a complete failure of the stunning. While I was trying to intercede in this regard, it did occur to me that this entire process was being, and should have been captured by video. However, in the process of the public interest disclosure and my subsequent treatment for PTSD, it came out in the investigation that the quality assurance manager, when asked for his opinion, had said, I have gone back and I have reviewed the tapes and there was no abnormalities at all. And I think this is one of the biggest problems within the department, is that there is a willingness to believe the plant staff over their own staff. And I think that the general tenor of their response was such that they were certainly in denial. Once I had become injured with PTSD, the matter became very legal and it was extremely adversarial. But my lawyers had written to the plant warning them that they must keep those tapes and we would like them to produce them. They made no effort to be cooperative in that regard. And I think people who are campaigning for transparency and for recording, it is important for them to know that I think there is a large degree of deception going on about how much recording is actually occurring. And my personal experience has been, I'm not sure that I could say it's always being done.
What happened following that day when you witnessed what you did at that slaughterhouse?
Personally, I was quite happy that I'd got the acting plant manager and the assurance team up there. They had seen the failure of the process, so I wrote my required reports. I got ready to depart. It was a period of school holidays, so my partner, who was a teacher, we returned to our small family farm, which is a long way distant from where we had been working. And about 4 days later, I started to have flashbacks. Now, flashbacks, I think people have a lot of Hollywood-inspired ideas about what a flashback is. But unfortunately, in my case, the flashback was very specifically one of the calves which had been rolled off the conveyor belt onto the slaughter table. And you can remember that I'd been witnessing this procedure over and over for several hours at this point. Not all the time. I was only there intermittently because I was going backwards and forwards and developing greater awareness of the specific deficiencies. But one tan calf rolled off the conveyor. Generally, the animal is restrained physically. They can be immobilised by the electricity without being desensitised. So while the animal may not be able to coordinate its movement, the staff could manoeuvre him. And while the animal's throat was cut, a large volume of blood came up and hit me over the left side of my chest. It was very confronting because I could feel the pressure of the blood, I could smell the blood, and the warmth of the blood transmitted itself to me. And at that time I had a very unusual physical reaction where it really felt just like a fuse had gone in my head. And I thought, this is a very strange sensation, but I was very preoccupied dealing with the matter in front of me. Once I had returned home, as I said, after 4 or 5 days, any time I was concentrating, my vision would become full of that image of that calf and I would be right back in that position. I had no other reality in front of me, but it was very brief. But of course, to have a complete hallucination take over your entire visual experience is a very confronting and challenging thing. I sought assistance from the department, and that began an entirely different sort of adventure in how public servants are treated once they become ill at work. A public servant becoming ill is the last thing the public service wants to have occur. And when I first approached doctors and asked for their assistance to explain what was occurring, they very quickly gave me the diagnosis, possibly you have PTSD. This is a major symptom of PTSD, having flashbacks. But I was not aware of, in very much depth about what PTSD was or how it manifests or what I was about to undertake as a lifelong incapacity, really.
After your diagnosis, what was your experience seeking support from the Department of Agriculture?
I thought the government, which is, as far as I was aware, should act as a model for in these circumstances, in fact does not. You become a tremendous inconvenience to them, and they adopt a maximally adversarial approach. Once I informed the department, 2 days later they asked me to go back to the same workplace and work there for several weeks. So I found that a very insulting response. I just had a belief that in a circumstance where somebody was injured with what is really a significant problem, they would have a sense of obligation. However, that proved to be completely misplaced. They encouraged me to do a thing called the Employee Assistance Program. The Employee Assistance Program consisted of a consultation with an occupational therapist who unfortunately paid so little attention to the interview that we had that the report that was written was filled with at least 20 to 24 or 25 inaccuracies. So you begin to get the impression that nobody's taking this circumstance seriously, or they are constructively misrepresenting what happened and laying down a large trail of false facts to obfuscate and hide what's going on. The psychologist that they gave me 3 sessions with effectively just said to me, "You are going to go through a really horrible process here. I've spoken with people who've been in circumstances like yours. The best thing I can tell you is just go away, don't have anything to do with it, and try and forget all about it." I found this a really perhaps realistic, but unfortunately rather confronting approach for these people to have. That was it. On my 3rd session, I was only allowed 3 sessions, I said to the psychologist, should I go and consult with a psychiatrist? And I was actually positively dissuaded from going to see one. I didn't take that advice very seriously. But I think that it reflected the same interactions that was occurring with the human resources team. They were using every opportunity or a missed email not returned or some other thing to say, oh, maybe this case can be closed. We can just get rid of this. This is not a problem. And I really thought this is a completely inadequate response. There's got to be something more comprehensive than that, but there isn't. And I approached the CPSU and they said, if you're injured at work, the department's not going to help you at all. You have to go and get your own doctors. You have to do it yourself. You have to get your own health certificates. You can't rely on the government from this point. You're a non-person from now on. They did let me go back to work, probably because that's the only sort of path they have, is to show, oh yes, we've not abandoned them, but we've given them a little bit of work. But actually, I probably should never have gone back on a plan, not while I was in the acute phase of the PTSD. So there's a complete absence of that desire to get the psychological support in place and to get the psychological judgment done. They didn't want to accept any responsibility in that regard because that would mean they accepted the diagnosis. And they're not in the position to fight that. They've got to leave that to Comcare to adjudicate. And the assistant directors have to hand you over to human resources. They really just try to intimidate you out of continuing your complaint. And the only reason I could continue was because I was old and I had financial resources to do it and fight the legal case. I was probably at least $100,000 behind by the time I got even the beginning of my payments of my Comcare. And young people are not going to have those resources available to just defend themselves, and the department leaves you alone. It abandons you effectively when you're in that fight. So I think that any vet who wishes to consider working for the government should consider this extremely carefully. You are 100% disposable and you will be treated as a disposable object. I was injured 6.5 years ago. It has taken me 2 or 2.5 years on psychotropic medication. I needed to withdraw from that because I didn't really wish to live with all the complicated side effects of being on psychotropic medication. And I have used a lot of assistance from clinical psychologists to really address the talk therapies, cognitive behavioural therapies, EMDR, exposure therapies. I have done almost every therapy you can do for PTSD at this stage, but it is both disgusting that the Australian government can treat its employees in this manner, and at the same time that I was injured, the Royal Commission into how the Australian government treats veterans was going on, and that really threw the whole process into very stark contrast with what people think would be done. And I think that it must be a systematic sort of approach of the government to treat people who have potentially compensatable diseases caused by their employment as the enemy. And they just really try to undermine you. They launch frivolous challenges to all the steps that are involved in promoting a Comcare case. They seemed to have, from the communications that were released to my lawyers, coordinated with people so that there would be confusion about what occurred. They would try to paint you as some kind of activist when in fact I was just really trying to do my job properly and professionally. So it's a very difficult process, and I had more sympathy for the young people in the Veterans Department who are relying on Veterans Affairs because they didn't have the age and financial capacity to sustain, because once you start this process, you need to employ very good lawyers to defend you, okay? And young people who are 28, married with 1 kid and a mortgage, are going to be destroyed by this process. I found the whole thing very difficult, very challenging. Yeah. So it was something that, one of the doctors who I had seen said, PTSD, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. It's a very difficult set of conditions to live with. But it was very disappointing and really undermines your confidence in the attitudes that must prevail in certain departments. And I think that this was unfortunately occurring in the Department of Agriculture, where you're working as well as you can to try and maintain your professional and ethical and moral standards. And the system itself seems to be accommodating of laziness, accommodating of the fact that you don't really do your job at all, because the industry will just like to grind on by itself, push out the product and not have anybody interfering in what they consider to be the primary purpose, which is the production of safe product, unencumbered by too many inconveniences like worrying about animal welfare or fit to load or not transporting pregnant animals or making sure that fetuses actually have died before you harvest their bovine serum. So there's a lot of problems that are built into this entire mentality that seems to be pervasive. And it was difficult to go from what looks like a department which has really abandoned the standards it should be pursuing. You become injured with a lifetime incapacity, and they adopt the same approach to you as they do towards the way they treat the animals, which is you're a discardable object and it doesn't matter what happens to you. So it's a very challenging sort of set of circumstances to go through over a number of years. My PID contained a lot of different instances of abnormality, and many of them were not addressed at all. There was no response at all from the government. And the really challenging thing was that they allowed themselves 9 months for the investigation, but at no time has anyone ever approached me to ask me what was happening. Nobody wanted to have, I guess, a record of what I was saying permanently recorded. It makes you very suspicious about what their motivations are. I launched the PID. I expected that I would at least be approached to ask, or even just to verify that I had seen these things. But there was absolutely no interest in having any contact with me at all. And I've never had any contact from anyone on these matters since. The way they operate seems to be, if we bury this, we'll bury it very deep, and then we can just pretend it never occurred. And that's a completely unsatisfactory way for these things to be left. The difficulty, of course, is that the ministers have the capacity to delegate. A lot of that delegation goes to the assistant directors and directors rather than to the vets. And I think that is a calculation to stop the vets doing their job as effectively as they would if they were left to behave in a way that made them adhere to their professional and ethical standards. My experience has taught me that the government is situationally expedient, and they are situationally quite capable of bending the truth very hard.
Did you ever find out what was done, like what investigation the department did do into what you witnessed?
No, there's no feedback to the people who make the complaints. My own motivation was really my disappointment in the lack of veterinary integrity within the department and within the cohort of vets that they've employed. Now, some of them obviously approach this as being a convenient way for them to have a job. They're veterinarians who will find it very difficult to make waves and to complain and to say this isn't acceptable, these standards do not meet the required levels, because they are dependent on the job for their own sustenance and to look after their family. That's why it was very difficult when at my age, I thought at least now the government will do the right thing and I will get assistance. But even in those circumstances, their priority is really not to give you assistance, but to try and make you disappear, to undermine your credibility, and to, really just try to hope the public doesn't pick up on these problems, that there's no opportunity for transparency to emerge. Just getting back to the ministerial delegation, I think the public would need to remember that when the minister delegates the authority to an assistant director to remove a veterinarian like myself, because I've reported animal welfare cases, because I've stopped the plant making money by reclassifying sheep as lambs, because I wanted to witness the swabbing of the carcasses, they're prioritising the commercial interests of the abattoir. But the person who made that decision was only an assistant director with his delegated authority. If you delegate authority, effectively the public should be thinking the minister is killing these 5-day-old calves, the minister is cutting this throat, the minister is allowing this to occur. But the minister hides as hard as they can and buries the whole thing in distractions and denials and hiding everything from the public. Throughout the process, we confirmed that there was an evidence of a lack of reporting at one of the establishments with the state authority. What that means is I had reported the animal welfare cases at a plant and they confirmed that those cases had not been reported. They looked at one, they don't mention the other 4. Why are they not mentioning the other 4? They choose very selectively to deny that the problems even exist. Just to get back to the particulars of the 5-day-old calves, the discloser's concern regarding ineffective stunning was found to be substantiated. However, evidence has been examined that shows it was reported, I'm assuming by me, and corrective actions were taken. So rather than actually investigating how that came about, why that was the case, they just don't mention it. That to me was the most important part of the PID, was to get that confirmation that what I witnessed and what I act on was confirmed by their findings. Because all through my encounters with Comcare and the department's approach as the adversary to me, receiving any sort of wage and salary compensation because I was injured, was denial. They coordinated that with the staff at the Abattoir. They falsely presented information to the Comcare review panel about rosters. They fabricated things that were not true. Staff from the Abattoir denied that anything had happened and said they checked the tapes, which they couldn't produce when requested by solicitors. It really just exposed a systematic problem. There's a problem in the system rather than the constant refrain of, oh, the lone actor, the one person who didn't get training, oh, that was an aberration. I think people need to look at this in a more comprehensive and holistic manner altogether. I had complained about the training that was occurring. This was a real feature that I thought was a terrible failure for the department. We were told we would have 12 weeks of training in the company of a mentor who would give us experience and guide us through our learning processes. My particular mentor was absolutely uninterested in assisting me. He was a very famous person in the department because of his hostility to the very existence of the verification system. Many of the older vets have become so idiosyncratic and independent, they just seem to deny that they have to do anything. The PID reads, my training with DAWE, Department of Agriculture, was farcical. I was sent to work with a permanent OPV at an establishment in. Sadly, he was a complete failure as a supervisor. His main contribution was to tell me the entire verification system was a joke. He had no confidence in the new systems that had been introduced, no doubt in large part due to his inability to utilise computers and his general disregard for the work being done. He was a rude and aggressive supervisor, telling me that all these new systems are due to us being controlled by feminazis in the head office in Canberra. Our jobs exist, he claimed, because of a worldwide effort by vets to ensure that vets have government jobs. Most of his day was spent sleeping, watching TV and wandering about looking for unusual pathological specimens. In 6 weeks with him, I received 0 instruction. He also offered to sign all the necessary units of job competency at once and was one of several people who told me that the exams used to show competency in various prescribed subject areas had all the answers available from the other vets. There were 12 or so modules of study with an accompanying job proficiency unit, and completing these was meant to take 12 weeks. This was a further area of gross incompetence, but this failure lies entirely with the non-veterinary staff, the assistant directors and directors. Over the last decades, the department has struggled to find OPVs. There are nearly weekly crises as vets cannot be found to be present on site. Each export establishment to operate must have an authorised OPV present. The assistant directors directly pressure their staff to become authorised before they have completed their training. This is bullying of staff, but is commonplace. In my case, at 6 weeks, the assistant director approached me and said, "Why haven't you finished your training?" To which I said, I was told I would have 12 weeks of training, and I pushed back very hard. This is something for people considering working in the department to be aware of, that you will be bullied almost relentlessly to be a convenient body As long as you've got a pulse, you can be an OPV. And I think that this bullying throws staff into work situations in which they are completely unable to cope. The evidence of this is found at many plants I worked at. Results of verifications and inspections at kill numbers would be weeks or months behind being complete. Additionally, the supervising veterinarians, the ATMs, the area technical managers, sign off certain levels of experience have been achieved during training, but that is not possible in circumstances when a vet is forced to start without completing their training. This is where I was talking previously about my own experience in this regard, because I had been told I can't go to early morning ante-mortems. So in my own case, I had not been able to complete the necessary ante-mortem experience that was required. This was largely due to restrictions placed on my work attendance by my assistant director. When it was time to certify that I had finished 50 hours of ante-mortem experience, I explained to the training staff in Canberra that I'd only completed the hours shown on my work diary. I have a very insistent nature that I want to be honest and tell the truth in these regards. They were insistent that I state I've done 50. I just replied to them, I have only done 35 hours experience. And the staff were mostly irritated that I wouldn't lie and fulfil the fourth requirement. I failed to understand the process where statutory declarations are signed when the information contained therein is not correct. Now, the response from the investigation was to investigate my training. I'd gone out of my way to make sure I had done the correct training. I didn't cheat in my examinations, but many vets aren't possessed of enough maturity and self-confidence to push back. If you're a 24-year-old or a 25-year-old and you've got a senior manager coming over and trying to do that, is bullying. That is just bullying. And many of the young staff do get bullied. They find the work is very stressful. It's a very challenging job, and they really are inadequately supported by that other half of the export meat program. And when I complained to the department that I had been to many plants where the vets were obviously pressured into saying, I've done my training after 6 weeks, and then they're put into jobs and they have no capacity to do that job at all. So the government's working to push people through the training. They're not really trained, and their senior veterinarians are writing statutory declarations, because I think people should remember, when a registered professional signs a document, that's the equivalent of a statutory declaration. And in my own case, I pushed this argument. Even while I was in training, I was aware of these significant deficiencies. As I've already said to you, the assistant director would not pay for me to attend early morning sessions of ante-mortem, so checking the animals early in the morning before the slaughter starts, purely to save money. But that's a very crucial part of your role, because that's when you detect your animal welfare deficiencies in the transportation sector. So fit to load is something that you can review at that time. Of course, it's physically possible to go and walk around and look at animals in yards, but you should be working in conjunction with the normal routine of the abattoir. That proved to be a fatal failure of my training with regard to the 5-day-old calves. Not because I didn't subsequently pick up the experience to understand when an animal was insensate or not, but just because they prioritised saving money rather than having an adequate training. And I would go to plants and I would see vets who would have no idea what they were trying to fill in, and I would think, I hope that this person gets time to actually get the skills to do the job, because it was disappointing that as a cohort, the vets didn't have enough sway that they could protect their professional integrity. Unfortunately, many of them just treat the job as a sort of sinecure, and they just want to have the position and take the money, and they'll keep their head down and they won't cause any trouble. But to me, I find that a considerable failing in the whole process, I'm afraid. Having transferred to another plant to continue my training, there was an unusual circumstance where there was the monthly audit meeting. That is usually led by the ATM who's responsible for the area, but in this instance, one of the FOMs was covering the plant. Field operation managers, there are only 3 in Australia. They're very senior people with great sway in the department. The previous day, or perhaps early in the morning, a truck driver had reported that one of the people supplying pigs to this particular plant had really assaulted an animal with a shovel. And the animal was separated in the stockyards, and when the other vet and I examined it, it was obviously very concussed. It had obtunded mentation, which means it was looking depressed, and it had a large gash on its head. This plant had had previously an engagement with some animal activists, and that had made management very sensitised to doing the right thing and approaching things in the correct manner. They had prepared a submission for the meeting and for the approval of the visiting auditor to report the person. But it became clear as the meeting proceeded that that wasn't the agenda that the FOM wished to have pursued. He down-talked the significance of the action of the person who'd assaulted the animal and tried to advance the argument that an internal sanction would probably be satisfactory. Now, an internal sanction is meaningless. I mean, they can be significant, but in this case, I think the difficult thing for me to observe was that the system was not working to maintain its own standards, but was in fact working to deny that those standards existed, and was quite happy to accommodate a very unsatisfactory compromise. When I went back to I stepped into a part of the process chain where the union and the management had a private agreement that the inspectors would not go there. Now, I was not made aware of that. They could have warned me, okay, this is a part of the plant, the union and the management, you know, we're in agreement, you can't go there. I have to say I have no reason why they were particularly bothered about that area. It was the area where they removed the genitalia. There's nothing usual about what happens there at all. So when I was walking onto the platform, I was surrounded by what often happens when you're the inspector inside an abattoir. There's a lot of yelling and screaming and banging of knives on metal pipes to create an uproar. And I thought, oh, there's something going on. I wonder what it is. And then one of them turned around and he was approaching me and he was waving his knife about, and I thought, oh, he's coming over to say hello. So I said, hello, how are you? And I couldn't really hear what he was saying. There was more knife waving. And I turned around and I could see the whole place was in uproar. So I came back down off the platform, and then people said, oh, you know, there's a private agreement here between the management and staff, so, you know, the inspectors aren't allowed to go there. That doesn't meet any legislative standard at all. There are no private areas. The inspectors are completely empowered to go everywhere. So that was a peculiar situation to fall into. But you can imagine that at that point I was 5 months injured. So I was still in the acute phase of PTSD. I don't think because of COVID I had even started any medication or therapy at that stage. And so that precipitated a complete physical and psychological reappraisal of my suitability to continue. And I actually had to contact my assistant director and say, look, this incident's too much, and with the PTSD I really cannot continue to work. So that was the end of my involvement with the department.